Appreciate the opportunity to be here and kind of give some updates on a lot of happenings, I guess, that are going over at the agency. A little bit of what I'll plan to cover today. Just briefly touch on most of the folks in this room I know will be aware of kind of the structure of Nebraska's water management. Of course, that's changed more recently with our agency merger. Talk about some of the existing state programs that are out there. I think sometimes we don't always appreciate all those existing programs that are out there and all the work we're putting into our water quality and quality management. Also want to just briefly touch on the merger and kind of reorganization and how we brought together two agencies through that process. And then I really want to focus a fair bit of the conversation around the governor's water quality and water quantity task force. This was a new initiative under Governor Pillen's leadership that we started last summer and recently concluded kind of the first phase with a number of recommendations. And then I think it's important, especially in the context of water quality, and we'll just talk a little bit about the Perkins County Canal project at the end and kind of where that's at, what we're doing, why we're doing it, a little bit there at the end. So we'll jump right in. In terms of water management, kind of the overview, this graphic's a little bit dated, obviously. Before the merger of the Department of Water Energy or the Department of Environment and Energy and the Department of Natural Resources, we really have a number of activities that were sort of distributed amongst those two state agencies. And so, we kind of break it down in these four quadrants with surface water, both from a quantity and quality standpoint, and then groundwater, both from a quantity and quality standpoint. Of course, in Nebraska, natural resource districts are a key partner and play a very significant role in the management of our water, particularly around our groundwater resources. Really a key partner to make all of this work are through our natural resource districts. And so when you think about before the merger, you sort of had Department of Natural Resources at the state level that was really focused on more of the quantity side, surface water, and then managing that connected water between surface water and groundwater with NRDs. The Department of Environment and Energy really focused on surface water quality. And then you kind of have the NRDs that worked with both of those two different state agencies, the Department of Natural Resources on quantity and integrated management, and then Department of Environment and Energy on quality, both in terms of surface water and groundwater. So really kind of streamlined things as a result of the merger. But I think, importantly, that's really going to create some benefits, I think, for the state going forward in terms of being a better partner with natural resource districts, but also having better, more coordinated leadership just around water management in general. So wanted to just jump through, all those kind of existing state programs that are out there. And this isn't really even all of them. It's a pretty good sampling of them in terms of what things happen at the state level from a water management perspective now under this merged agency. There's probably a few others in here that we're leaving out. And this doesn't even really bring in those programs that would be happening more at a local natural resource district level. I shared these slides here with the task force at our first meeting, and I got a lot of people just, appreciating that there are so many different facets to what we do in terms of water management in Nebraska, and it is hard to keep up on all of those pathways that we're working through. So I'm going to go through these in relatively short order. I'm happy to, of course, to make slides available after the presentation. I saw folks maybe taking pictures, so you don't feel you have to do that. We'll make these available. So number of programs, we're just going to jump right in. Resilient Soil and Water Quality Act. And there's no particular order necessarily to these programs, just kind of the order that are put together. This is a newer initiative that was started in 2022, came out of an own independent Healthy Soils Task Force group, really focused on the health of our soil and what do we need to do from a state leadership standpoint to improve soil management. And so out of that, one of them became, I think, a significant focus on partnerships with all of the conservation organizations working in this space. I think also a real focus around we need to empower our producers more with those peer-to-peer conversations and really try to focus a lot of our effort in creating more of those opportunities, finding those partnerships, helping stand those up. Sometimes it was just as simple as providing a few $1,000s for an event to be organized and being able to bring producers together. And then I think trying to also, and we're still working on this, I mean, it's sort of an ever-evolving process, but working on streamlining access to those conservation resources and program information. I mean, there's there's so much information coming at today's producer out there, right? In terms of all of these programs that are available. It's hard to know which program is the best fit on their farm. They leaving something off the table. Is there something they should be waiting for? Is this really the best program? What are going to be the requirements of my participation there? Is it conflict with some other program? Questions that are a real challenge for a producer. We're working to try to streamline and organize that information for them so they can have a more accessible kind of library of those resources. So one of the efforts that was put together through this group was sort of a coordinated website. There's a whole bunch of partners involved in this. I mean, I don't want to cast this as this is just the state. All of our natural resource districts, all the various conservation partners, the university, and there's a whole host of all of our commodity boards, a host of folks that are participating in this organization. And so, really kind of tried to put together a website, tried to bring together those conservation resources, make them a little bit more accessible to our producers. Interestingly, I would point out one of the initiatives that actually came out of this effort, which has been timely now this spring with the wildfires, is actually the creation of a livestock grazing exchange, kind of a way for producers to connect with each other in terms of producers that had opportunities to graze livestock and those looking for those areas. That's kind of come a little bit more to the forefront here with the wildfires and trying to make those connections. So again, just one area of kind of more recent emphasis. This really started in earnest about 2023. The next one I would point to, again, kind of a more recent initiative, a lot of focus around reduction of nitrogen application on farm. One of the first initiatives that came out from the legislature anyway was the Nitrogen Reduction Incentive Act. This was led by Senator Ibaugh, where basically they were providing us funding to be able to initiate a program to stand up in partnership with the NRDs, where we would have producers enroll into this program, seeking the goal of having them reduce their application rates by the greater of 15% or 40 pounds on farm. Really, again, all of these really probably relate to key partnerships with NRDs and other organizations, but we're able to stand this program up in pretty short order. We tried to make enrollment very simple. I think the first year we were able to enroll about 150,000 acres into the program. We actually exceeded the allocation of funding we had available, but we were able to find some other funds in the department to fund those applications. And you can kind of see on the map there, we had kind of these priority areas around the state. Really, the red areas sort of focused in on those areas where we have irrigated lands that are sort of in areas where we have phase areas and wellhead source water protection areas. So kind of focusing in those NRD quality phase areas and more vulnerable areas in terms of drinking water supply. Priority B was focused on just areas where we had irrigated agriculture, knowing that irrigation is something we wanted to be mindful of in terms of nitrogen management. And then we were required to make the program available statewide. So then basically all of those other areas in the state come in and participate in the program as well. We've actually been fortunate with this program to continue it with a partnership with Corn Board. They provided an additional $1 million this year, keep the program running. And as I move through my presentation, I'll talk more about kind of the future of this and some other programs we'll be running going forward around nitrogen reduction and nitrogen use efficiency. On the Department of Environment and Energy side, there was a reverse well osmosis program. I think that was stood up really out of some of the ARPA monies that were available around 2022, provided rebates for private drinking water wells that tested above 10 parts per million. And there was private wells provided rebates essentially for those reverse osmosis systems. Over about 370 applications, $1.3 million in funding. I think some entities across the state have continued to operate that program. I think Lower Elkhorn may be one example where they're continuing to provide some funding to resource that type of program going forward. Also, there was a set of funding that was dedicated towards just having the Department of Environment and Energy do a nitrate in drinking water study. I think it was a good resource that kind of identified maybe further refined understanding around challenges out there around nitrogen management. Focused on a lot of sampling, particularly in domestic wells. If you're not familiar, we already do a lot of testing for all of our public supply systems, and those are tested frequently. We know that water is safe. Yes, there are challenges at times to make that water safe, but we know that water is monitored regularly. Really want to see all those domestic wells testing at least annually as well. So there was a concerted effort to try to get out there, do sampling, bring some of that information into our library of knowledge and be able to kind of make decisions from that. Out of that also came a number of tools and resources from that study, kind of educational materials that were made available, online GIS mapping products, outreach tools. And there was a public water assistance ranking system that was also created as a result of that too. And I'll maybe show that a little bit later too. Non-point source. So, we have non-point source programs. This is probably what you've referred to as your 319 program. These tend to be, these are funds that come in through EPA, sort of a planning component, a project component typically that comes along with 319 programs. So you're doing a watershed planning effort around quality of non-point source. And then through that, there's also on the back end competitively funded projects for implementation that come out of that planning effort. That program receives an allocation of about $2.5 million a year. Not all of that. I think maybe about half of that is typically allocated towards projects in any given year. So state revolving funds, these are a big source of funding for our communities across the state for both clean water, wastewater treatment, and drinking water. SRF funds saw a significant uptick in terms of funding as we saw the IIJA and bill monies and other things come out of the federal legislation during that period, and saw a pretty good uptick in those areas. If you're not familiar with kind of how state revolving fund programs work, there's typically an EPA designated federal amount of money. There's a state match component to that. The idea is you take these funds in, you essentially bond with those dollars that come in on a regular basis. You then revolve loans out to communities. They pay very low interest loans. I think currently we're operating at about 1.5% loan rate, including the administrative fees. And then in addition to that, there's a certain criteria that are set up that provide certain communities loan forgiveness as well. So they can get the low interest loan and they can get a portion of that forgiven under certain conditions. So that's how the typical process works. There's two components, like I said. There's a clean water SRF, which is focused on wastewater. That has a little bit lesser funding in it. You can see the type of projects there that are typically going to be funded out of those loan programs. And then there's a drinking water SRF, which has more funding in it, but there's also more to do under the drinking water SRF. And again, you can see the kind of examples there of programs that get funded. There's also been, of course, more recently, there's been focus on things like lead service line replacement, PFAS, some of these emerging contaminants that are coming out. At this portion of our SRF oftentimes is used to help those communities prepare for those new regulations. Sometimes that's us providing assistance with paying for sampling, inventories, work that we did on lead service lines across the state. So there's kind of different, I think perchlorate is the next emerging contaminant that's coming into this list. There'll be some sampling work that'll be coming out from that. So kind of used for both the project side, to do drinking water system upgrades, treatment, but also, being brought together with some of the new emerging contaminants being addressed through that fund too. Wellhead protection, over 500 wellhead protection areas across Nebraska. These generally are going to be kind of your community water systems. Some of you were jogging there. I don't know. Jogging for 15 minutes. We have a number of wellhead protection areas across the state. Generally wellhead protection areas are going to be, the goal is to keep things that are dangerous to that water source out of those community areas. For potentially contaminating that source that a community is relying on. Kind of a local planning effort done with those communities, and our agency works with them. There's a little bit of money there also to help with some inventory, some other planning work that might come along with that as well. Similar program, but a little different also would be then the source water protection program. Source water is going to be focused on that public education, best management practices in those areas around source water for our drinking water in our communities, trying to remove contaminants from pathways that might affect that source water, restoration, conservation, and source water protection area, and then monitoring at critical points in that process. So you can kind of see various source water protection planning efforts that are also going on across the state. Again, some minor funding there that helps us do pilot projects with some of the communities across the state. This has been a significant emphasis. This is really, when I started with the state of Nebraska in 2006, this is really what I started in, was all of the integrated management planning, particularly the blue areas that were started first, where we had to do the planning. We had to do things like compact compliance and get into that work. That has really, I guess, blossomed over the last 20 years. We now have integrated management planning across the entire state. We've layered into that basin level planning in many of our basins. Even if they're not listed on that basin planning map, we're still often doing broader coordination. If you think about the Niobrara Basin, we meet with all of those NRDs on a frequent basis. Game Parks is part of that conversation as a significant water right holder. Similarly, things like that happen in the Blue Basin and other areas of the state. So a lot of planning, a lot more work going into, I would call it more the grassroots, working with the individual local NRD stakeholders in that entity to try to bring together thoughts around, this is probably more focused on quantity management, but we are looking to kind of blend quantity and quality management so we can make that process more efficient, particularly in the eyes of the stakeholders that participate in those groups. Out of integrated management planning, there was established a water resources cash fund. This was back in 2007. That fund essentially was initially set up just to be available to those fully and over appropriated areas, kind of the south and western portions of the state. And then over time has been broadened and allowed to be used in different ways. We've done a lot of really great work with this fund, leveraged it in very significant ways. We've probably implemented well over $100 million of projects, since 2007. And these are projects that have really helped us. If you think about Republican River Compact compliance and compliance with the Flat River Implementation Program, Recovery and Implementation Program, these are investments we're making in partnership with NRDs, irrigation districts, other partners on the landscape to really try to make a fairly significant impact on our water quantity management, particularly in those interstate compact areas. But now, as we've kind of moved into voluntary integrated management planning, we're also using these funds to do other activities in eastern parts of the state. Some of these water quality initiatives, like the Nitrogen Reduction Incentive Act I mentioned earlier, we were also pivoted to using some of these funds to help support those efforts. And then maybe the last one I'll touch on in terms of existing programs is the Water Sustainability Fund. This is one that was put together by Senator Carlson, I think came online about 2014, if I remember right, and provides funding for kind of a broad range of water-related activities, both quantity and quality standpoint. A number of really great projects have been funded through this program. Sadly, we've seen our last transfer of funding to the Water Sustainability Fund. We'll see if that changes going forward, but it's been a really good fund. We've done a lot of really good projects. Think about projects like, Hastings did their reverse osmosis project for nitrates, flood control projects up in Tapio, Missouri NRD, significant investments in some of our irrigation districts for critical infrastructure and updates. A lot of really great projects, a lot of just science work, a lot of AEM data collection has been funded by the Sustainability Fund. But that one's been broadly used, I would say, for both water quality and water quantity management. So that was a very quick and fast run through of some of those existing programs that sort of reside under the state agencies' purview, and that we work through a lot of partnerships to deploy. There's probably even some other ones I'm not capturing, but just want to make sure people appreciate all the tools that kind of are out there existing. So with that, I did want to just briefly touch on the merger of the two agencies, how we brought together the Department of Environment and Energy, Department of Natural Resources. This happened officially last July, so July of 2025 was the kickoff date for the merger. And I think it made a lot of sense, particularly around water. And I think that's really what motivated the governor to want to move in this direction of merging the agencies, was to put better leadership and focus around water in this state. And that really was about, if you remember that graphic I showed at the beginning where we have that water drop and having multiple state agencies, you got quality or quantity. I mean, I certainly have heard and even have been part of conversations of, well, we really want to put this quality item. Well, that's not our agency, that's another agency. And so we just want to be better at managing our water at the state level. And I think the merger gives us that opportunity. And I think you can kind of see on the slide, this is showing the before scenario where the dark blue is sort of the DE side, the lighter blue is the DNR side. There's a lot of water related programs. And I'm not trying to suggest these folks weren't working together. They certainly were. But I think it just gives you the opportunity to maybe work in a different way when you're working next to people every day. So through this effort, we've merged, and this is kind of the new structure of what things look like. There's a director of the agency, that's myself, and then the chief water officer. And the way that was mapped is, and that's Matt Manning. That essentially accommodates all the duties that the former DNR director did. If you think about the DNR director, they were sort of the appointee to all of our interstate compacts and agreements. They do things like issue certain orders around water rights. So there was a desire to make sure we kept that legal structure intact as we transitioned and merged the agency. So the chief water officer assumed all of those roles. So it's kind of interesting. I tell people, yes, I'm the director, but when it comes to really making those decisions about those water related items, it's actually Matt. Those authorities exist under Matt, and we did that intentionally to make sure we retain those. I think importantly, what I would point out is, all of these items in blue on the right-hand side of the slide, that's really those water-related programs. We wanted to make sure we were thoughtful about putting those programs together. And I would say even more recently, we've continued to tweak this, not really in terms of that we got the right water programs under the chief water officer, but even within those water programs, making sure the working groups are put together in a way where we're making the best use of our folks, getting them together to work in the most efficient ways. So if you think again about like wellhead protection, source water protection, we've now just more recently blended that into that integrated management planning effort. Doesn't mean there's not going to still be those requirements of those plans. It just means those folks are all going to be working together, thinking about a common direction of where we're trying to go for water management. And then, other elements of the programs, if you think about the NDE side, all the environmental programs, remediation programs, monitoring programs, engineering permitting programs, those all are still intact. We've reorganized a little bit in some of those areas. I think it was really good. We did a lot of listening sessions before we made decisions about reorganization. I met with every section individually to make sure we got their feedback and take that into account before we made final decisions on kind of the merged organization. But I think we've gotten to a very good place. Doesn't mean it's perfect, doesn't mean it won't change, but I think we've gotten to a very good place in terms of the objectives of bringing more focus on water and bringing the agencies together so that they can operate more efficiently. Certainly, we focused on in terms of messaging, really these sort of 3 C's, which are pretty basic. I like to try to keep things simple, but really, of course, first and foremost is always the customers, the people of the state of Nebraska, everybody we work for, and try to make sure that everything we do, we first think about what are their needs, how do we do things better from their perspective, and also with each other within the agency. How do we work together better? How do we make that collaboration work better within the agency? Communication, if you're around me at all, you're always going to hear me talk about communication, the importance of communication. In my career, I think any challenging issue I've run into throughout my career, the root cause was a bad communication event that happened somewhere early in that process. So I think if you're good about communication, you're effective about your communication, it can help you out a lot as you go down that pathway and make decisions, bring everybody that's necessarily needs to be part of that conversation together and make sure we're doing that effectively. And then, of course, culture, we want to make sure we have a positive culture, a lot of science that we do, so we want to make sure we have scientific integrity in our work. We're using that science to make decisions in our policy, in our permitting, but we're also looking for innovation, right? I mean, we're not We don't do research necessarily, but we're always looking to the research. We're looking to the newest things, and how do we bring that into our agency to help us with make better decisions. So, to the Governor's Water Quality and Quantity Task Force. So, I don't think, again, surprising to folks in this room. Why did this get initiated? I think it's, the governor, I would say it's simply the governor wanted to see progress on water quality and water quantity in this state. I think particularly around water quality, a lot of concerns about nitrates in our groundwater. What can we do more proactively to try to address that issue? Understanding that it is a long-term legacy issue, but let's be more proactive, more thoughtful, try to engage earlier and try to find some solutions there. The direction and the focus really in our conversations, the governor always liked to talk about using innovation and education, not regulation. So a lot of our recommendations ultimately came out of that directive. But, you can see, obviously, it's very telling in terms of what we have for quality challenges across the state. Water quality, of course, with this ongoing drought, very concerned about water quality as well in some areas of our state, and making sure we're being very proactive in our management. Of course, we know things like data centers, other large water use come online. Those can have compounding effects. So we really want to be thoughtful in making sure we're being proactive in identifying ways we want to bring large water uses into these systems to not have negative impacts on all those other folks that have made investments and been maybe using that aquifer for decades. So, again, the real directives that the task force was working under, kind of these three charges: be action oriented. Let's be, let's take that initiative, think about what we need to do today to protect future generations, focus on results, not more studies. We really wanted to take the knowledge we've gained and what do we do to put that into action? What does that look like? Doesn't mean we don't need to continue to learn, but those actionable things we can try to put on the ground and start to implement. And then, of course, like I said, really targeted around nitrate reduction. What are the things we can do? What programs are working effectively? How do we amplify those programs? And then create new strategies, because some of these things are not working the way we want them to. How do we refine those? How do we make them better? So in terms of the task force itself, governor designated 20 members to the task force. You can kind of see their distribution across the state, generally representative of NRDs. There was some agricultural interest, livestock interest, well drillers. The University Extension was represented in there. Cooperatives, engineering, kind of agriculture. So, public power, irrigation. So there was pretty broad cross-section of folks that participated on the task force, a lot of experience there. I would say overall, really good conversations amongst the task force members. You always worry when you do these kind of activities. But you can have, the 2 or 3 people that really are the loud voices in the room and everybody else are just kind of the wallflowers. We really didn't have that. We really had great communication. All members were participating, and I thought had really good open dialogue about a lot of actions that we needed to think about. We did divide ourselves into kind of 4 subcommittees that we worked through a number of items on. And then we did participate in kind of monthly conversations. So you can see those 4 subcommittees are listed there on the left. We had a methods and resources group, water conservation and quantity, financing and incentives, and then nitrate legacy and drinking water access. And those 4 subcommittees were sort of self-identified by the task force. Those weren't sort of directives necessarily from the governor. Those were just sort of natural distribution of kind of the thoughts of the task force members of how we want to organize. You can see kind of the full list of all the meetings that were held in terms of the full task force. Each of those subcommittees was meeting at least monthly. Most of those were done in person. There's even been additional meetings beyond those kind of listed here that talking more about implementation tasks. That will continue. But I think just wanted folks to appreciate the level of effort and commitment of time that all of these task force members put into coming up with ultimately their final recommendations. So a few slides here just to go through some of those key recommendations, and I do have a link at the end of my slides that you can see where to go get the full report if you want to see that. There's also kind of a more abbreviated version of the report if you want that. Overall, there's 14 goals contained in that report across the 4 subcommittees, each of them with a goal, set of action items, and then some metrics we identify for how we want to track and monitor our success as we move forward with implementation. So, I mean, first and foremost, they're listed here, discussion around the need for water measurement across the state. A lot of discussion about should it be metering or should it be measurement? Do we want to make it mandatory? Do we want to make it voluntary? I think ultimately, if you kind of look at the recommendations, it's sort of this, we want to provide the opportunity for producers to move in the direction voluntarily and use some of the programs, which I'm going to talk about here in a bit, to make that transition, get to where they're measuring their water use. But if we don't see progress, and you'll see this in the task force report, if we don't see that progress, we know we're going to have to require that. So I think we're trying to move in the direction of really making sure water is measured in all areas of the state. There are another areas I do want to point that out, and it's in the task force. There's a nice summary. If you look across our natural resource districts, there's about 53% of wells for irrigation currently are metered across this state. That number surprised me. It was a little higher than I thought it was. So there's a lot of measurement that's already out there. I think we want to see that measurement expand. We also want to see it become maybe a little bit more useful in terms of real-time information that producers can take advantage of as well. Second key bullet, a lot of discussion around was statewide education, increasing the number of individual engagements with producers. I think when we started looking at what programs do we think are working most effectively across the state, a lot of the discussion came down to those programs where individuals at an NRD or other organization, because there's a lot of other partners out there, they're sitting down across the table from a producer and they're talking about what's happening on that farm. How do we improve that? And I think that's where we're seeing some progress is occurring. That's a lot of work. There's a lot of people to engage with to be able to do that. But I think the task force and some of our recommendations, we're trying to amplify that effort, resource that effort a little bit more, and allow for more of those individual engagements, as well as those peer-to-peer engagements. I mean, we want to really amplify those opportunities as well. I think also focus a lot around, those folks that are giving those nitrogen applications to producers. Let's make sure they are educated. Let's make sure they are meeting some minimum certification requirements. There are a number of them that are, but we want to make sure everyone is. We want to try to provide that education for everyone that's providing those recommendations. In terms of nitrogen management, a lot of discussion around we've got to get more of the application to the end season. We want to reduce the overall way to get there without having real negative impacts on our economy, on the profitability of that producers. We got to move more of it to be in season. We got to get the technologies in their hands to be able to do that. The equipment sometimes is necessary to make that transition and move in that direction. So a lot of discussion around that. There's probably multiple goals actually related to that initiative. We want to be more proactive with our drinking water systems. We want to identify where there might be those challenges coming to community wells sooner, help them identify them, help them plan through that. Is the best alternative really just to re-drill a well in that same area? Or do we need to look at other alternatives? Maybe sometimes that's going to be regionalization, working with other communities in the area. Sometimes that's going to be there are some emerging technologies in this space too. We don't want to discount those, but I think it's kind of more of a proactive look at where we need to be working with those communities. So the last couple I just touch on, no task force is complete without talking about funding needs and money. Of course, we had a finance incentives subgroup. So I think there's recommendations in there about, having our agency really work to put together a better inventory that's more real time in terms of what are the needs out there, across our communities, across our irrigation infrastructure, our overall water portfolio, like where are the needs? And then also, what are the opportunities? What are those funding opportunities that might fit some of those needs in this current environment? So I think trying to get a better handle on that, a more up-to-date and proactive assessment inventory of what those needs are. And also, start a conversation about funding models that might help sustain that. I mean, this is my career. I think this will now be the third time we've kind of initiated that type of conversation. But I think really trying to focus on first, what are the needs? Let's be clear on that. And then what are kind of the funding models that might help us support those needs? And what could that look like? And I did mention One Red, which I'm going to touch on here in just a second. One Red is a major initiative for us. It is an EPA grant that came out of some of the greenhouse gas emission reduction, kind of climate action planning efforts in the prior federal administration. The state was fortunate. We received a $307 million grant. Over half of that money was actually dedicated towards advancements in precision regenerative ag. The idea being that carbon intensity being a good measure of kind of overall farm impact, standing up essentially a registry in the state that would allow a registry data bank that would allow for us to track that, engage producers, help them understand the potential value that might create for them, first of all, and the market opportunities that might create. But then we're going to be layering into that additional incentives that help them move in the direction of not only reducing that carbon intensity score, but really focusing on the resource management items we've been talking about here, reducing nitrogen application, reducing water application. The great thing about that is we focus on our resource management and we message it that way. It just naturally feeds into lower carbon intensities. Those things are very much fit together. We don't have to sit here and, debate climate change, carbon, we just can talk about our resource management here in Nebraska around water quality, water quantity. Let's improve that. Those things can fall out. When those fall out, they create market opportunities for our producers that don't otherwise exist. And so that's part of what we're trying to create with One Red. Farmer First program, got to safeguard data. We want to build on the strengths of everything we've been doing. Voluntary, producer-led. We're going to do this through partnership with NRDs, other industries, what we call approved service providers. And this will be sort of supplement implementation funding towards the education we want to do, those engagements we want to do with producers, but also a number of on-the-ground programs. So we've been working with the task force to really outline what this program is going to look like, at least in year one, which we're hoping to roll out this fall. But essentially, there'd be an enrollment opportunity for the producer, which is nothing more than they're signing up to be comfortable sharing data. Just for doing that, they can get a $2,000 bonus and $500 each year of participation. They don't have to do anything more than share data that allows us to see how their farm is operating and give them kind of baseline scores, if you will. There's no penalty there. There's no assessment. They don't have to achieve any minimum metric. It's just data and sharing. Once they do that, they also look at access to essentially our incentive programs. There's sort of 3 tiers within that program. There's a nitrogen use efficiency program, particularly around sort of corn production, an equipment and technology program, and then a soil health program. Each of these are still being refined, but generally speaking, that producer would have $9,000 to then be able to use across those 3 tiers. In terms of, if they want to go down the nitrogen use efficiency route, there's sort of 2 programs there that focus on nitrogen use efficiency, maybe for more advanced producers that are already achieving at a high level, but they can receive a payment. Also those that are trying to gain, if you will, if we can see improvement in their operation around nitrogen use efficiency, they can be awarded with per acre payments. They can include technology if they need the equipment and the technology to move in that direction. Again, primarily focused around nitrogen management, water application, but it can be also equipment that's needed, rental equipment needed for maybe doing soil health, cover crops, other things. And then the soil health category, really trying to stand up. There's a lot of work being done on soil health, a lot of cover crop programs and other initiatives out there. We didn't want to stand up another one just to compete against those groups. Rather, what we want to do is say, hey, here's those list of programs for a producer to participate in. You pick. We're going to give you an additional incentive for picking one. And then kind of create that partnership there that they can leverage our funding with that additional funds in those programs to hopefully increase adoption of some of those soil health practices. Some other details here won't go into great depth. Still kind of in the development phase with the task force. But I think we are hoping to engage, maybe ambitiously, we're hoping to engage 10,000 producers across the state with this program. You do the math, $12,500 available. It's a $125 million investment in our producers across the state. We're not asking them, we're not trying to target large operations and acres necessarily. We're trying to get everybody to understand how these technologies can be integrated into their operations, help us with resource management, and help them with profitability. Because that's the win-win. I think we all talk about it. We all see that opportunity. We want to give them that opportunity to be able to take advantage of and bring into their operation and hopefully decide to expand that into their operation. This is kind of a quick list of equipment. That's again just draft, not final, but just gives you kind of a sense of the types of things we're looking at. It'd be kind of all of your typical tools around precision, regenerative ag, nitrogen management, water application management. Meters, any of those telemetry devices, ET measurement, soil moisture probes, pivot nozzling, all those types of practices that we want to be able to support. We're trying to make sure that it's clear that those programs can all be 100% cost shared. Of course, they can't double dip into another program for equipment, but if they're in a cost share, say with an NRD that's providing 50%, we'll pay the other 50%. Similar for NRCS, if they're in an NRCS program, we'll pay that remaining program. We're really trying to make it as easy as we can for coming into this program, but also adoption of those practices. In terms of where we're at, we recently brought our contractor online, selected them. We're getting the contract stuff finalized. That'll really kick off then through the summer. We've been working very closely with a number of conversations with cooperatives, natural resource districts, trying to make sure that the way data comes in, is through those common pathways, if you will, that producers are comfortable with. We'll never take ownership of any individual producer data through this program, and that's intentional. We'll only ever see aggregated county data on our end, and that's all we'll report out through the grant. So that data stays intact, it stays with the producer. We'd have to get their consent to ever be able to share that. And that's consistent with what the conversation has been around ag data privacy in this year's legislature. So we're hoping to roll this program out live around Husker harvest days timeframe this fall. Start to get some information out a little bit more earnest here as we get through the summer. Okay, so just covered. I know I don't have a lot of time because I want to leave some time for questions, but I do want to talk about the Perkins County Canal Project. It's obviously gotten a lot of attention. It is the biggest investment this state has ever made in water. So I don't think you can discount the significance of it. I think it gets there's a lot of misinformation, I think, that gets thrown around about the project. The project right now, sort of the compact, I should say, not the project. The compact is sort of in some litigation right now between Colorado and Nebraska. I won't really go into that today. We'll be waiting for kind of a Supreme Court decision on that probably here in June in terms of where that goes. But it really doesn't slow down what we're doing with this project. We continue to make a lot of great progress. If you're not familiar with this, we're kind of out in the obscure southwest part of the state, South Platte River, primarily, coming out of Colorado. There are two components to this compact, and there's other articles, but primarily two key provisions. One focuses on an irrigation commitment that Colorado made to us back in 100 years ago now with this compact. And you got to keep in mind, you got to put yourself kind of in the frame of mind of what was going on in the early 1900s, right? All of this surface water irrigation was being developed in the western part of our state, in Colorado, Wyoming. So a lot of these compacts and agreements came together around the recognition of these return flow systems that we were creating, diverting water to the river, recharging aquifers, and essentially creating more consistent base flow from those aquifers. That was a novel concept in the early 1900s. We were still learning about it, but people were understanding it. That really became kind of the fundamental basis for why this compact came into existence. Nebraska's canal, Western Irrigation District, that was downstream from the state line, they had an 1897 water right. They wanted to be able to put themselves into the priority system of Colorado so they could keep people in front of them, or junior to them, from getting water in front of them. And that's the way things work in Western water. We use a priority system. This right gets it first. Others have to come in Others that come in after that have to pass the water to those senior users. Colorado saw kind of the concerns that could develop as they were thinking about their future. So ultimately, there was a negotiation of the compact. Again, it breaks it into two primary components: an irrigation and a non-irrigation season. There's 120 CFS commitment during the irrigation season, and then there's that 500 CFS available flow to Nebraska, but it's conditioned on the fact we build this Perkins County Canal project. So it's an interesting compact. They all are. I've read many of them across the West. This one is no different, and but very interesting in that it sort of provides Nebraska this opportunity to secure a water right that it can protect itself against that upstream Colorado development. With it, that one has a 1921 date. So, quickly, what are we trying to protect ourselves against? It's really just this continued upstream pressure and development we've seen on the South Platte River. Not going to go into great detail. This comes from Colorado's planning documents, but they generally see about a 250 to 400,000 acre foot gap in terms of their demand as they look out into their future from ag and M&I use. Interestingly enough, 250 to 400,000 acre feet, that tends to be about the amount of flow that comes down the South Platte River annually. Okay, so just want to put that in context. The water that typically would come into Nebraska historically, they want to develop all of that if they can, because they have that supply gap in their future. If you think about the state of Colorado, right, they don't have other sources really to go after. The Colorado River is not a viable solution going forward. They do bring a lot of water over from the Colorado Basin to the South Platte Basin, but that future probably doesn't look very promising. So they really focus their planning and legislative efforts around the South Platte River and its development. Look at what's already going on in the South. There was a pretty significant change in the direction of Colorado's water management in the early 2000s. Came out of some in-state court cases they had, were basically water wells that were depleting that return flow system. All of a sudden became required to provide mitigation in a more meaningful way, maybe than they had historically. That led to a lot of new developments in terms of taking water, particularly during the non-irrigation season, putting it into recharge ponds. You've probably seen some of those if you've traveled I-76 and kind of gone up the interstate there. They fill up those ponds during the winter. That's so that they can pump their wells in the summer. That's the concept. That water replaces their depletion. That effort, some of the projects that have come online, we've really seen, about 90,000 acre feet diminishment of our right, which is over half. It's over half of the water right we're entitled to is already being taken up by Colorado to meet that demand gap they have. There's already a lot of planning projects on the books in water rights, seeking water rights, and they're easily looking to take the rest of our water right without action. And if you don't do anything under this compact, you don't really have a means to protect it. So that's really the driver for the project. If you look at what's happened in terms of state line flow, like I said, there was sort of the fairly consistent period, albeit there was some variability and probably some change. From 72 to 02, represented on this graph, that's the state line flow measured at Julesburg, Colorado, for 72 to 02. Then when you kind of go past some of those court cases, you see the state line flow, particularly this is non-irrigation season. During the non-irrigation season has dramatically shifted downward. We see for the last 20 plus years there, significant decrease. That's about a 40% decrease in those state line flows. And then as I said, as we look at those projected increases in development, they just keep going down. And you can sit there and you say, what's the impact of all of this, right? It's substantial in terms of water quantities. So I want to put that in front of you here. So you can see even in a year like this where it's dry, there probably would have been about 77,000 acre feet more water available to Nebraska. You can see that hatched area on each of those that has a hatched area. That's representing the portion that Colorado's using. That's water we didn't get to have come in Nebraska this year that they're consuming, they're using in the state of Colorado. And then there's also within this constructs of this project, there's also the ability to capture what is referred to as surplus flow, these kind of net future flow terms that are defined in the compact. I'm not going to go into the details on those, but in total, it provides an opportunity, for over 200,000 acre feet of water. on an annual basis. That's kind of looking at the last 20-year average. I'm not trying to say all of that water is under Nebraska's right, but a good portion of it is. And so I think with the project, we're really talking about, I go all the way back to this chart quickly. We're not necessarily talking about restoring it to the blue line, but can we curb that yellow line from getting worse and maybe improve it just a little bit? That's our objective. That's really what we're trying to achieve. And it's a different type of project in that regard, right? We're not necessarily trying to build a project to source a whole bunch of new acres or build a new, city somewhere and support them. We're just trying to hang on to what we have because of how important it is to the state. And just if you think about the importance of it, who's impacted, this kind of sketch captures that. We're talking about irrigation, of course, that's its first and primary use, but there's so many intertwined connections in our irrigation system out west on the Platte Basin. Lake McConaughey operations directly integrate with this project. Gerald Gentleman Station, our largest coal-fired generator out there by Sutherland. These environmental needs we know we have to be able to compete with and meet in the Central Platte for critical habitat there. Our NRDs in the state, like I said before, we've invested over $100 million trying to return this basin to a 1997 condition. If we see less flow coming on the South Platte, our work essentially gets diminished, right? That effort to try to help balance our supplies in Nebraska, that investment just immediately gets eroded. And then if you even go to the eastern part of the state, Lincoln, I think, identified, particularly in drought years, which unfortunately this is shaping up to be one, it can provide 7 to 10% of their overall water supply at the well fields. We have our well fields in eastern Nebraska. So it really has reach across the entire state is the important point to capture here. We have recently released our permit application. It was recently released by the Corps of Engineers. We're in the 404 permitting process. You can find all this information online, Googling the Corps Perkin County Canal page. You can go in there, see the full application. This is just an overview map of the project, kind of broken out into segments and the reservoirs. Detailed breakdowns by sort of sub-segment, if you're interested in that kind of detail about the project. But like I said at the outset, it's the most significant water investment we've ever made as a state for good reason, because this is a multi-generational impact. Lack of action, it's really not an option, right? If you don't act, you're essentially saying we don't need that water and it's going to go away. That's really kind of where it's left. So with that, I will conclude and see if there's any questions about it. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. That was a great overview. I was probably aware of 30% of the programs or the coverage that you talked about. So it was a great appreciation for what Nebraska has to offer. My question goes back to the governor's task force. I've skimmed through the recommendations. I'm curious what you anticipate as timelines or anticipated updates or revisions to that, and more specifically, what role do you see in wetlands to be featured in subsequent guidelines? They weren't wetlands, both in terms of water quantity and quality, weren't emphasized or really focused on in this set of recommendations.
Yeah, so I'll take kind of I see two questions there. So the question about kind of the frequency of kind of, reviewing and updating. Each of the goals does kind of have a set of metrics. They're unique to each goal in terms of timeframes. I would say the task force, we had our meeting in March where we kind of released the recommendations. I think as a group, we know we want to get together at least once a year, maybe twice a year, keep monitoring our recommendations. We know we may need to adjust as we kind of go down the path. So I would say there'll kind of just be a continuous discussion there. With regard to kind of the specific questions about wetlands, we didn't really get into it in detail. I don't want to say it was never talked about in the task force, because it certainly was. I think what I would say, there is kind of an element in there where we talk about identifying those opportunities, particularly for like recharge and set of co-benefits we could create from quantity and quality. And kind of doing more of an inventory of where those opportunities exist. I think that will be something, I know that will be something we're working on. We currently have a partnership with Rainwater Basin Joint Venture, where we support them financially to be able to recharge into those wetland lakes areas in their jurisdiction. Great project. We've also, had conversations with other entities. I know I visited with Andy Bishop there and talked about, can we expand the scope of that reach across the state? I think those kind of win-win opportunities are really things the task force wants us to focus on. So I absolutely see a space for that to happen. We've traditionally done a lot of that work out of our like water resources cash fund dollars, some of the sustainability fund projects. NET has funded some of those efforts. So, I think that funding will remain in some form. Like always, though, I think the key to those kind of projects are the partnerships, right? We got to kind of bring together the partnerships to make those effective.
Thank you.
Yep.
I understand well, first, that's a lot of information. I would be interested in getting the slides. What's the best way to do that?
Dan? Yeah, you can email me.
Okay.
Yep.
And I understand the problem with nitrates and the legacy aspect of it. And I'd be interested to know if the task force had discussions on CAFOs and their contribution to the problem. And it seems that when you do have a CAFO that is the source of a significant nitrate problem, has there been any thought to remediation in those types of situations?
Task force certainly talked about this. We talked about, there's some benefits there, obviously, with those livestock facilities, right? We can get the manure integrated back into the system. I think there's a lot of positive benefits that can be created by that. Managing it well is important. But I think in terms of kind of constructs for remediation, there was discussion about, I'm just going to say in higher nitrate areas, is there ways that we can use that water? I know even ideas about, bringing it up for hay crops and other things, is kind of a remediation opportunity. I think those are all things we have to continue to be creative with and work, in partnership with folks in those areas. So I don't know that, there isn't really a specific recommendation in the task force around kind of what you're specifically hitting on. But I don't think that prevents us from trying to find opportunities where it's going to make sense to do those types of activities.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned about the 500 recharge ponds or basins that Colorado has built years. Are they specifically for ag use, or there are some cities that are using those or supplementing their?
It's both. What Colorado typically requires under their state law is when you have a well, and this is what some of the stuff changed in the early 2000s. When you have a well, you have to have a companion sort of augmentation plan that goes with it. So you got a well, it's going to create a reduction in those return flows. So you got to have a plan put in place that's intended to mitigate that. And so that can be for both municipal use and for agricultural use. Sometimes you even see plans that are commingled, if you will, where a municipality and a group of agricultural users is using the same recharge facilities, or maybe they're trading credits. Those kind of exchanges happen as well. So they can be for both.
And most of these happened in the last 20 years or so.
Well, technically going back to 1969 is when Colorado sort of updated their law when this was supposed to become required. I think in practice, we're just looking at the data that's available on their public portals. They weren't really doing it in full execution, particularly in those early years. And I'm not here trying to make a legal argument. I'm just trying to say it doesn't look like that level of effort was being put into it. I think that's kind of what their courts said. And then I think that's why you saw the real uptick in the early 2000s was they knew they had to get very serious about it, at least internally from their state, and tried to make more effort to recharge that water, which is why we really saw a great reduction in state line flows on the resulting end of that. Other questions? Anything on that? Richard?
Oh, what are you looking forward to now that you have all this task force work done and things are organized? And yeah, you've established a new baseline. So
I mean, the exciting thing is the challenge, right? And so we've got kind of like I said, we've got a set of 14 goals in front of us. It's going to be ambitious to kind of push forward on that. One red is a key component of implementation as it relates to engaging our producers. It's exciting. You got a big opportunity with a large grant. It's also pretty daunting. The goal of trying to engage 10,000 producers across the state is, I think, pretty ambitious. I think rough numbers, I think if you really boil it down to number of producers on row crop, particularly for irrigated, you're talking about hitting 2/3 of them by the time you get to that number. So that's a pretty high percentage. So I think the challenge is exciting. I think rolling out that program will be really interesting to see we're trying to take away pretty much any barrier of entry to that program. So it's as simple and desirable from a producer's perspective to participate. We want that to be very effective, right? And we see that as there's a real win-win opportunity there for resource management and on-farm profitability. So I'm excited about that. I think also very excited about kind of where we're going to go with education. There's a lot of discussion there, again, about how do we really streamline our curriculum. We all often have our messages, but I think we want to try to get something that's a little more tailored that kind of represents a more coordinated message, particularly around nitrate, work around nitrates. And that's not just with producers. I mean, that could be in our healthcare system, our communities, a variety of audiences that we need to be having that conversation with. And also the education front, one that gives us a bit of an opportunity to also fund kind of coordinator positions we're envisioning in each of our NRDs and maybe some other partners with us, where they can do more of that one-on-one conversation that we think is effective. Right? And we're seeing results from that. There's a number of examples that were given by task force members of conversations that happened with a producer, kind of opened their eyes to what was happening on farm. Immediately then, in the fall, you're being able to make adjustments and see improvement. And that really happens because of that one-on-one conversation oftentimes. And then, I think those are kind of areas I know I'm most excited about. But all of it's going to be, priority for us to be working on. So. I just check on my.
Most of them just want a copy of the presentation.
Copy of the presentation will be with that. In the back.
So wonderful talk, a lot of information as mentioned. So this task force is new, but let's say in 5 years, how do you plan to evaluate if this is a success or not?
Well, first and foremost, that's why we kind of set up those metrics in the plan. We wanted to know what we should be monitoring in terms of outcomes. So if you look at like any given goal, you'll see that there's I'm going to take movement to in-season application, right? So we're going to track that. We're going to monitor that. We're going to see, are we moving that in a positive direction? And so from there, I think the idea is monitoring that, on an annual basis. Are we seeing change? Are we seeing progress? Do we need to change our approach? The programs we're rolling out are not effective towards that. Our education isn't hitting effectively to help move in that direction. That'll be kind of the opportunity to reflect on each of those goals with those metrics in hand to say, are we getting to the desired outcome we're trying to achieve with this goal? So again, we focused a lot on kind of year one implementation activities in the plan, but we did make sure every one of those goals has a set of metrics, with the idea being those would be reviewed regularly by the task force and used to adjust as we need to move forward.
Can I have the last question?
I think so you can put out the last question.
I'll start with the next question. Excuse me. Piggybacking on that, you mentioned statewide measurement of water levels. Was the task force have an idea?
I want to say statewide measurement of water use.
Water use, yes, thank you. Was there, how do you envision that coming to fruition? How do you see that as a metric?
Well, again, I say, we're measuring about half of the irrigation use today. We want to get to 100%. So that's ambitious. I get it. But that's where we're trying to get to. And we're trying to, if you look at one red, that producer could come in, Peter's paid for. soil moisture probe is paid for. ET measurement is paid for. Your subscription package for telemetry is paid for. We're trying to take that off the table. Why wouldn't we measure our water? Right. So I think that's, if you're talking specifically around measurement, that's how we're trying to get there. It's not going to just happen though. You know, we're going to need, our entities are going to be key partners. You know, I think a lot of discussion too. And I would encourage you, if you have the time, go through the whole report. There's an appendices, but in that appendices, you kind of see all of the experts we invited in, all the presentations we saw as a task force. You know, entities are doing a lot of work, right, to try to bring producers into this 21st century of data and data collection. You know, they're doing work around what they call Producer Connect, which is their new sort of statewide data platform. I think the idea being there, let's get all the data coming in. Let's then sort of be able to show, not in a way that's sort of in your face, but just like, hey, let's show how you're doing in your neighborhood. You know, benchmarking essentially concepts, right? Like, let's show your nitrogen use efficiency in this county relative to others in this county, or your water application rate relative to others in this county. So I'm trying to use those prompts. You know, you gotta get the data first, and then kind of building in those prompts and those kind of reinforcement cycles, right, through the education that can come in on the back end. It's going to take time. I mean, these things don't happen overnight. We realize that as a task force, but you know, I think the governor also wants to see progress, and so we're going to try to use this grant, use this opportunity to really jump forward on some progress that I think is there that we can make. Do you want to take the last question?
Yes, you're on there, somebody. Hi. So, this is something regarding your planning group, water planning group, as well as the NRDs. I was hearing that in the Blue River Basin, there is some allocation or some pumping. So how the NRDs, when they set the limit on the pumpage, how they work with you, or how your planning groups really work together with them, so you decide this is the pumping.
You know, again, I think the great thing about Nebraska, right, is we have NRDs, we have local control over our groundwater management. I think that's why we've seen a portion of the aquifer be more sustained than a lot of the other portions of the aquifer, High Plains aquifer. So, you know, when you talk about kind of specific conversations about like applications, you know, sometimes we have had a more active role in that. I'm thinking areas like the North Platte NRD, the Republican Basin, where we had, in addition to maybe some local groundwater motivations there in terms of aquifer management, we had interstate motivations. You know, we needed to be in compliance with these interstate agreements. So that was more of a conversation where the state was a more significant participant in what's an appropriate allocation level that helps us achieve an outcome. You know, areas like the Blue River Basin, they're not necessarily subject to those same requirements. There's a compact that's very different, like I said before. So I mean, I think a lot of what's motivating like allocation discussions in other NRDs is just, you know, they've had entities for decades, right, have had groundwater management plans, and all of them have triggers and things that happen as a result of seeing all of their monitoring work they do on the aquifer. Things get triggered, and then it puts them into different phases of management. Allocations become a phase of management for those NRDs. So, you know, they may have triggered a water level decline that is beyond what the board wants to see. It moves them into then an allocation discussion. We try to resource that with, you know, our technical knowledge, our modeling ability to be able to help them understand what those allocations might achieve, right? And so we've done modeling, I think, of things like the Upper Niobrara White, you know, in Box Butte County area, you know, looking at allocation levels and what kind of groundwater level change might result from a given allocation level. So we kind of resource it that way. I don't know exactly what we've been doing with the Blue Basin NRDs, but some of that's also driven as much by water quality too, right? I mean, we're seeing that we all know there's that interconnection and interplay there between applying irrigation water and what we're putting through the soil and into the Vado zone and beyond. And so, I think that conversation, very long-winded answer, I would come back and sum it up to say, kind of depends on the circumstances of when allocations are being discussed, but a lot of it is happening just at a local level. That NRD its groundwater management plan and its desired long-term sustainability.
Thank you.
All right, let's give Jesse a round.